All right, so this set of notes is going to cover the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So, as always, as you guys are doing these, make sure that you're jotting down anything that you find pertinent that you need to remember or refer back to. And as the questions pop up, make sure that you're focused and attentive and answering them to the best of your ability. Um, so, there's several things that happen with the Industrial Revolution, including an increase in global population. This is largely due to the advances in medicine that we talked about in the first set of notes about the smallpox vaccine, also with the increase in the discovery of bacteria, and there's the beginnings of some concepts of germ theory that happened in the Industrial Revolution. People start to live a little bit longer lives. People are dying less frequently from some of these fairly significant diseases that have been plaguing people for centuries. Many people are going to increase their standard of living. So, your standard of living is the amount of goods and services you have access to. So, in today's world, you think about things like internet and internet speed, vehicles, cell phones, electricity and running water, and those sorts of things. But also like clothing and furniture and that sort of thing all count as some of your standards of living. And in the Industrial Revolution, you have the access to many more people for several of those things. Obviously, not like cars and cell phones and stuff, but the amount of things that people are starting to accumulate, but also access to things like doctors and that sort of thing are all going to start to improve. Particularly, though, that's in relationship largely to how many people are going to be moving into the city. So we're going to jump to that one. That many people are moving into the cities. We talked about that with the British enclosure movement and the end of the cottage industry system, that more people were going to have to get out of the country and into the cities looking for work because they no longer had the ability to graze their animals and that sort of thing. So there's going to be cities that are growing, and those people are going to move to the cities and then work in the factory systems. We also have transportation that's going to improve with the invention of the steam engine. So now we have train travel and steamboat travel, which are much, much faster than horses and sail boats. There is going to be an increase in pollution. So with the steam engines, you also have to have the boilers, and we're largely burning coal in those systems. If you think about like steam trains, right, coal trains, you picture like the West, right? If you think about Wild Wild West kind of imagery, you think about these steam locomotives that are chugging across the United States with those plumes of smoke rolling out of the locomotives, but also the factories are going to burn that same system. And so there's a lot of smoke and smog emerging in the air. We are going to increase education for a lot of people, especially as they start working against child labor laws, or towards child labor laws and removing children from factory work and mining work. We promote free public education, at least in the elementary years, for everyone. You're also going to have movements where the working class is going to be very unhappy with their working conditions and start to speak out against those things. You're going to start seeing people lobby the government, people picketing, people protesting their working conditions, and people working with collective bargaining, people trying to make things safer at their jobs. You're also going to have, for the first time, when you're thinking about your unit summaries for the grapes, you're going to talk about here that there's going to all of a sudden be a middle class. This is part of our social structures. So Europe and really most of the world has been operating with this kings on the top, peasants on the bottom system, but now we've got this middle class that's emerging of skilled workers and managerial positions that are going to get paid a little bit more than what the peasants would have been paid. So there's started to be a little bit of a separation there between the poor, the rich, and then this new middle group. All right. So there's going to be major impacts on the function of the family. Largely, the concept that the world before was that you were industrious within your home, and so you lived at home, you worked at home. almost always your family was around, right? Your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins were all in the same village. They're all in the same town. A lot of people are still living in the same places. And when they move to the cities, you lose a lot of that. And also, you have dads working outside of the home, but you also have women and children, especially teenagers, working outside of the home during the day as well. So, the Industrial Revolution, because of how intense the working conditions are, really how dangerous and violent the working conditions are, one of the things that happens is that the workers organize themselves into labor unions, and those labor unions were working to improve the rights of workers and improve the working conditions in the factories themselves. And I think that particularly this picture on the left here, gives a really great example of those working conditions early on. Number one, the age of the people in this picture, right? Look how young these kids are. But then, this kid is not even wearing shoes. They are standing with their legs in between these spindles that would have been moving for the threads to roll up on. And it was the job of kids in particular to do this job because they were smaller and they could fit and they could move quickly through the system. So I think that's a great visual example. Oops. Of course, that one is a picture of a labor union. And then if I go backwards, I think now I'll get, yeah, there we go. Now we'll pull this one up. Should give you guys another great example. Whoop. Think about you've got this kid right. Oops. Sorry, I didn't pick the pen back up. This kid and this person. Look how young those kids are working in this factory. And then these belts would have all been moving. Imagine the sounds in this factory with all these engines and pulleys and things moving back and forth. But it's a dangerous world they were living in. So the factory system itself, we've already talked about this in the past, that the factories were replacing what they did in the family when they were working out of their own homes. Women and children, we've already talked about this, are going to compete for those jobs against men because women and children were cheaper. Generally, their wages were cheaper, that you didn't have to pay a child or a woman nearly as much. And we actually still see that impact in today's world, not with the children, of course, but with what you might hear referred to as the wage gap, that in the United States, women earn more than 20 cents on the dollar cheaper than what a man works with the same qualifications in the same position. It's not for all positions. It's not for all kinds of jobs. It's not in every field, but the national average is that a woman doing the exact same job as a man in the United States is going to earn more than 20 cents less on the dollar, which is fairly significant. What you're thinking about if you're putting it in other terms is that a man who makes $100,000 in a year, a woman doing that same job is going to make $20,000 less. So 20 cents doesn't sound like a significant amount, but when you look at it over a year, it's fairly substantial. We already talked about that we're using children, which is going to keep their costs low. The workers' lives are going to be completely controlled by the factory system. There's countless stories of how we didn't rely on clocks until the factory system. We did things as the sun rose and fell, but once the factory system came in and you were working 6 to 6 or 7 to 7 or whatever, you relied on the bell, and that factory bell kept the time for the entire town. You also can look into mining towns in the United States and learn about company stores where you were paid in company dollars and then you had to spend them in the company grocery store and you couldn't leave. Your houses were owned by the company itself. You paid rent to the company for the right to live in a house close enough to be able to work there. So they had control over every facet of your life. One of the wonderful things that emerges out of the Industrial Revolution is the abolition of slavery. So we've talked about how the cotton gin, that's what this one is. This is a cotton gin. It also doesn't look very spelled correctly, but it is. This is an actual cotton gin under Eli Whitney's plan. But the cotton gin increased the demand for labor. But what also happened then is that there was a lot of public outcry for the abolition of slavery, and that had been going on for a long time. There's a lot of discussions about abolition of slavery in the 1700s. But in 1807, the United States and Great Britain outlaw international slave trade, so that Middle Passage as part of the triangular trade where they were taking people from Africa and sending them to the New World, that is stopped. The legal system to that is stopped in the early 1800s. In the 1830s, Britain becomes the first industrialized country, the first Western country to abolish slavery. They're not the first country, because Haiti actually takes that claim. But the first powerful country to abolish slavery is Britain in the 1830s. And then, of course, it takes the United States a civil war in order for us to end slavery in the United States, and that comes in 1865. I think these pictures actually do a better job of describing the Industrial Revolution and its impacts than any of the words on the screen. I mean, it talks about women and children working and how people fought for the end of labor, people fought for suffrage, which we gain in the United States in the early 1919. But I think that some of these pictures maybe do it a little bit more justice. You've got kids, little kids. That little girl's about 3, standing, working in a textile mill alongside her mom. You've got this kid, these boys, right, working again in textile mills, right? Those are sort of maybe upper elementary or middle school boys working in factories. This is a coal mining town, right? Look at all those kids. We want to go to school, right? I think we've all had times where we didn't want to go to school, but these kids are trying to get out of working in factories and trying to go back to school. And then this one I think is the most powerful. Let's bring this little kid to the front. That kid is about 3 or 4 years old. For perspective, I have a kid who is about to turn 4 as I'm making this video. And he's working. He's got a coal miner's helmet on, and he's got a pipe of tobacco. And that's the reality for people and their families in the 1800s. And that's what they're fighting against. So that's where labor unions come into play. Those labor unions are going to fight for things like changing working conditions and higher wages and getting rid of child labor, minimum wage, minimum age, right? That you have to pay people a decent amount of money, that you have to be a certain age to go to work, to be hired legally. And that system where you're working within the government, when you're fighting for laws to change, is called lobbying. But when you're working within your company, when the workers are organized up against the managerial staff, that's called collective bargaining, where they're working just within their business as opposed to working within the entire country. So, all right, that's all we have for this video. Let me know if you have any questions.